Okay, so today we're going to talk about totem poles and identity. And to begin, there are many misconceptions about First Nations peoples. Specifically, the art that they create isn't well understood by Europeans, right? One popular phrase is the low man on the totem pole. We're here to tell you today that that phrase is incorrect, and my partner Allie will be telling you why it is incorrect later in our presentation, but just keep that in mind to begin. So some learning objectives. We're going to talk about totem poles, the medium, and their evolution. We'll also talk about Tommy Joseph's The Hunt. That is our work of focus. And then we hope to connect the medium, Tommy Joseph, and some larger thematic issues. To begin, let's define a totem pole. Totem poles are monumental sculptures carved on poles with symbols or figures made from large trees, mostly western red cedar, by indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. And they often exist in a ritual context, meaning when a totem pole is raised, as you see in this photo, there is a potlatch. That is a ceremony. The word potlatch comes from the word to give. So they exist in a ritual context. They mark a specific moment in time. Moreover, they're meant to decay. So once the potlatch has concluded, the totem pole will stand until it begins to decay naturally. The point of its decay is to, again, mark a specific point in time. Additionally, part of the spiritual belief behind totem poles is that they represent the interconnectedness of life. So a natural part of the life cycle is for things to die and to decay. And we're going to talk a little bit later about modern totem poles and how their traditional cycle, their traditional life cycle is being altered such that the decay process doesn't happen. So keep that in mind. There's a great diversity of totem poles in their form and their faction, and that typically deals with the type of totem pole that it is. So there are different types. There are house poles, there are mortuary poles, there are commercial poles, and that's what we'll focus on today, commercial poles with Tommy Joseph. So again, stylistic diversity depending on geography, and generally they represent origin and lineage, rights and privileges, supernatural experiences, exploits and achievements, acquisitions and territories, marriages and memorials. Essentially, they are recordings of cultural identity. That being said, they have secular purposes as well as spiritual purposes. Function. There is a great diversity in function, and again, that goes back to what type of pole it is. Overall, totem poles serve as historical monuments or documents of great meaning and values to the cultures that carved them. And this is a historical example. This is a watercolor that was later engraved by John Weber. So the image that is depicted was carved by John Weber. He's a European. It depicts First Nations people, and in the back you see house poles. So that's an example of what a house pole would look like. And this serves to give you an example of the interaction between First Nations peoples and Europeans, and how the totem pole and its evolution has been affected by the interaction with Europeans. And here's a contemporary example. This is a replica of a mortuary pole, and it was constructed originally in 1878, and the replica was carved by Bill Reed in 1964, and it's located in Stanley Park, Vancouver, Canada. So this pole, it's being constantly maintained, which again goes back to the fact that it is not allowed to decay. We're preserving it so it doesn't decay. As I said, the totem pole evolution has been affected by the interaction of First Nations peoples and Europeans. We're going to use Canada as a prime example. So the potlatch, was banned in 1884. And because the potlatch was banned, that means that the totem pole was then banned, because the totem pole only occurs within the potlatch ceremony. So in 1884, the Canadian government bans the potlatch. And then between that period in 1920, different organizations, specifically museums, were trying to excavate different totem poles so they could curate them. And then in 1950, a totem pole restoration project began. The potlatch was no longer considered illegal under the Indian Act, so people began to make totem poles again. And today we typically know totem poles in a commercial form, meaning we see them in museums, or meaning that they're sponsored by different organizations and institutions. So that brings us to Tommy Joseph and his commercial poles at the Carnegie Museum.
So our primary work of focus is actually Tommy Joseph and his commercial pole that was commissioned by the museum called The Hunt. And we're focusing on him and his work to get a better understanding of the cultural changes that have happened over time to the totem pole, to keep up with the modern times, and the specific ways that he kind of combines the culture's past and its present together. So Tommy Joseph is actually an Alaskan master woodcarving artist, and he's from the Tlingit Native American tribe of Southeast Alaska. He's very well renowned for his woodwork and his traditional crafting of Tlingit items like armor, masks, and bowls, and he sells them at a gallery in Sitka, Alaska. And his pole, The Hunt, was commissioned by the Carnegie Museum of Pittsburgh as a commercial pole to sort of preserve this as a cultural artifact. One of the general themes of his work is his cultural preservation through combination of traditional and contemporary symbols. So he combines symbols used in his tribe to represent descent groups and beings, along with more modern symbols that we will actually see a little later on in his pole, The Hunt. So he uses traditional carving tools, which you can see on the screen here, and he was one of the few that during the potlatch ban continued to learn and how to create these totem poles so that it could be continued eventually when the ban was lifted. One of the traditions that he actually breaks is he allows his audience to watch him as he carves. Traditionally, you're not allowed to see the totem pole until it is being raised at the potlatch ceremony. So he sort of creates this awareness by having people connect with him and what is going on by letting them watch him. So here's his pole, The Hunt, that's currently on display at the Carnegie Museum, and there's some people looking at it. So The Hunt's actually a commercial pole, which means it's commissioned by someone for a purpose. It's like representing an event, but it's like purposeful representing through someone else. It's not like I'm raising this to show like this is where this event happened. There's actually a ceremony alongside the raising of the totem pole at the Carnegie. However, it was very altered with the potlatch ceremony, because normally there's this big banquet that happens, and there was no banquet because it's a public place, so it was kind of a silly idea to feed all those people. But there was traditional song and dance that was continued as the pole was raised. So we continue to see that shift in tradition to modern culture. And inside the museum, the totem pole, of course, will not naturally decay like it is supposed to, but Tommy Joseph believes that it's all very traditional still, and that the art form is continuing to evolve the way it always has. So he's very supportive of like the adaptation of the potlatch ceremony. So here's another angle of the pole, and we're going to read the story of the hunt, and then we're going to take a look at the symbols. So we're not actually going to point out like this symbol means this, because the totem pole is not a linear narrative as we've seen before in the column of Trajan, but it's more of a guide with the story, which is another misconception a lot of us have about the totem pole. So here's the story of the hunt. While out in the open ocean with a storm approaching, a young man spotted a large seal and fired at it. He was happy to see that his aim was true, and he piloted his boat over to haul in his catch. The young man grabbed the seal by its tail, but it began to thrash about. So as not to lose it to the ocean waves in the approaching storm, he bit down on the tail, gripping hard between his teeth while grabbing the seal's flippers with his strong hands and arms. In a boat not far away, the young man's hunting partner and clan brother was watching the entire scene unfold. He fired a shot into the seal, saving the catch. The hunt was a big success, and both men were able to bring food home to their families, along with an adventure story that would live on for generations to come. So that's the traditional story behind it. Oops, sorry about that. So we're going to take a look at the pole now and look at the symbols. So on the bottom, you can see a raven symbol. So this is where the phrase low man on the totem pole kind of comes in and is misconceived. The descent group represented is the Raven descent group, which was actually Tommy Joseph's father descent group, because the entire story was about his father and an elder and their experience out at sea, and the museum requested a traditional Raven story. So he chose his father's descent group, which was actually the Raven, and that's placed actually at the bottom of the totem pole because that's the eye level view, and it is more considered the more important piece of the totem pole, which is why we look at it eye level. Moving up, you can see the two hunters and the boat that juts out of the pole, and then the top symbol is actually the dog salmon, which is another traditional symbol, which is the circle of life being represented. So the seal eats the salmon, and then the people eat the seal.
So the themes of Tommy Joseph's work are obviously culture and identity. His work, The Hunt, is a representation of his identity, which would lead some to say that this is cultural property. That's an important term. So we want to ask the question now, is cultural property affected by museum location? One possible answer to this would be that the fact that Tommy Joseph himself, as a Tlingit artist, is altering the tradition means that he has his own agency. So therefore the museum location is rendered less significant because the work is being made by a Tlingit artist who is choosing to alter the tradition in a way that he sees fit. Right. Some closing remarks.
So why is this important? Why are we learning about this? Basically, it's important because the totem pole is this very traditional and cultural symbol that we've sort of taken we've warped it a lot until it's become this very commercial thing now that we just think of. So it's important to understand, the actual cultural identity of the totem pole and the meanings behind it, and have a very knowledgeable and true knowledgeable idea of what this actually is. And it relates to our study of art and history and other people, because it's learning about, these native peoples that had this symbol, and it's just getting a better understanding and learning about, is it okay if we continue to create this commercially, or should we let it go back? And it's all about the combination of tradition and contemporary art.
Some discussion questions. Are we preserving culture or changing it? Who is we? What is culture? These are some really big existential questions to grapple with, but they're important nonetheless. As we mentioned before, agency. Would you say that Tommy Joseph has agency in his work? Do the Tlingit people have agency in their work? An exercise? Try reversing the phrase low man on the totem pole. Now that you know that this conception is actually a misconception, it is fundamentally incorrect, reversing the phrase is necessary, right? Low man on the totem pole.